Thank you so much for inviting me. This is such an important topic, and I think especially during these times of COVID, which of course around the world, everybody has had different experiences with that, but I think it's really brought forward a lot of these issues around equity in STEM, and particularly around intersectional gender equity in STEM. So I have a presentation today, PowerPoint slides. I'm not sure if you'll be able to continue seeing me. I'm going to screen share, but it's going to be interactive today. So we will take pauses and do some polls and have some time in the chat. So I'll start the screen share, the presentation. So everybody seeing the presentation, are we good? Yes. Okay, so I want to start off with a land acknowledgement. Portland State University, where I am based, occupies the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. We are here at PSU on this land because of the sacrifices forced upon the ancestors of this place. It is important to honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. And below is a link that you can use to look and find the indigenous legacy and ancestry of the land that you're on. So I encourage you to check that out. It's really fascinating and important. And it's especially important for those of us working in STEM fields to acknowledge the connection to the land and the legacy and history of settler colonialism and the different forms of colonialism around the world, because science and technology historically have played an integral role in supporting the processes and institutions of colonialism. Sorry, there's a little lag here with my presentation. So as you heard, this is just a copy of my CV, as you heard in the introduction. In STEM and in these kinds of talks that we do, we often highlight our professional backgrounds, and you'll see from here really kind of conventional approaches to explaining who we are and ourselves. And you'll see, like, I have a PhD in cell and molecular biology from Cambridge and biology from Harvard. I went through several postdocs before I came to my position. As my path, just from my CV, is a little unusual because I received my degrees in biology, and I was actually a faculty member in biology before. In 2013, I became a faculty member in women, gender, and sexuality studies. But if you look back, you can see, I did a postdoc in women's studies, and I directed a few programs focused on women and gender in STEM. However, this kind of presentation and the way we present ourselves professionally, it kind of hides the deeper background. There we go. It hides the stories behind that. And so if you look here is a more, less linear, less what we might say less professional approach to who I am and my background relative to STEM. So I grew up in a forest setting. And when I was in 7th grade, that's when I decided I wanted to become a biologist. We dissected a frog, and I was just really, I didn't necessarily want to kill animals, but seeing what was inside that frog was so fascinating. But then through my high school time, I was the only girl in my high school AP chemistry. That's an advanced placement type of advanced STEM class. And the boys in the class really sexually harassed me very overtly in ways that in this era of Me Too, we would really be horrified at. I attended a community college where I studied archaeology. Then I went to Harvard, but I have that degree up there on my CV, but that doesn't show that while I was at Harvard, I was so disillusioned with my STEM classes that I switched my major from biology to art for quite a while. And then eventually I came back to biology because this love of biology and the things that I was doing kind of overrode that, and I was able to persist. Also, I've quit academia several times. I've moved around. You don't necessarily see that. We patch together our CVs to hide those kinds of things. Also, I'm a single mom. I adopted 2 daughters as a single parent. So there's sort of that work-life balance. And then behind all of this, of course, our identities play a role in that. Living here in the US, I am a white woman, grew up in a middle-class background, had access to different kinds of education that not everybody has, and those kinds of intersectional identities also play an important role in who has access and what our paths and experiences in STEM look like. So I thought that's enough about me. Let me see how this, here we go. That's enough about me as the speaker today, but I thought it would be important for us to also see who else is in the room here and what your locations, are, where you're located, what kind of fields you're working in. So we want to do a poll. I think can we do the poll while we share? I think we have to stop sharing the screen to do the poll. Okay. So the poll is up. Are people seeing the poll? So you can look through these different affiliations so we can get a sense of. And then you can put in the chat where you're located, what your area is, if you are in, for example, biology or chemical engineering or math, or what's your area of research or study. And if you're not from ETH, then you can put down where you're located. Great, so we have a couple of math people, computer science, social anthropology, secondary math education, pre-service teacher, functional genomics, mechanical engineering, math, Ava, that's my colleague, PSU. Great, so, and we've got undergraduate, graduate student, senior faculty member, and so share results. Okay. So we've got a second poll. The second poll is regarding identities that people, different kinds of identities that you might identify with. And of course, you know, whatever you feel comfortable sharing with us here today, because as I mentioned, not only where we're located, but also our backgrounds and our identities intersect, and our intersectional identities intersect with gender often too. So poll 2. So I think, there we go, it's poll 2. So we ready to, did everybody participate that wants to write into the poll? So are people, we're sharing the poll, yeah. So not surprisingly at a talk with this subject, we see most of the people here are identifying as women or she, her pronouns. We have some LGBTQ representation, immigrant, racial and ethnic minoritized. Here in the US, we often use the term BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. I know that depending on our geographic location, that can vary. And of course, being in a European setting, being non-European, disabilities, and first generation to attend university. These are all identities and social forces that intersect in terms of both our access to participation in STEM and then our experiences for those of us who get into STEM, also influence our experiences. So I'll go back to the presentation. Let's see, screen share. So present. So we've done this. So oftentimes when we look at intersectional gender equity in STEM, we hear and use metaphors. The glass ceiling, this is in the title, and this is something that most of you are probably familiar with, the idea that there's this invisible glass barrier above us from coming down from above, that particularly women and of course intersectionally women, gender intersects with racial identities, with immigrant status, with disability, but that glass ceiling is there that prevents people from being able to ascend and rise up in their careers. There's also the idea of the leaky pipeline. This little image is from Nature, from a blog post that they have. It's actually talking about that there might be too many women in the life sciences pipeline. And here you see this kind of idea of stuffing a lot of very highly gendered pink, that's the symbol of the woman that has a skirt on, pushed into the pipeline. And then you see it oozing out, the pink oozing out along the leaks along the way. And then there's this idea of also invisible walls, and sometimes referred to as the maternal wall, that particularly people who are primary caretakers of children, which tend to be women and mothers largely, are having to carry over these burdens over that wall. And that all of these are factors that cause gender disparities in STEM. So next slide, there we go. So we've gone too far. Okay, sorry, there's a lag in my presentation. Despite these kinds of barriers, women in STEM can and do break these barriers. So I don't know how well this is going to work here. Let's see if we can click on this link. So you still seeing my screen? So there are many examples of women who have been able to break these barriers. So it's important to recognize that women can and do break these barriers, as prominent as we tend to hear about them. So for example, here's a link. Afrotech has a link of 5 women who shattered glass ceilings in STEM. These are Black African-American women. We see Dr. Patricia Bath, the first Black doctor to land a medical patent for a device to treat cataracts. We see that she was also the first person to document that Black people suffered blindness at much higher rates compared to other racial groups. And this speaks to the importance of having intersectional gender diversity in STEM, because when we have diversity and we have more women of color in STEM, we can also ask important questions that get overlooked otherwise. And so I would encourage you to visit these links. Let me see how this works here. Go back here, and I click this, and we're back to this. So I would encourage you to visit these links to learn more about these important role models in STEM, breaking barriers, and particularly women of color. So some of the factors that have been shown to be important in helping to break down these walls and shatter through these glass ceilings and keeping women in the pipeline are the importance of role models, having a mentor that can guide you, having early research experiences early on, getting to be able to be engaged in research helps people to stick with it and helps improve the persistence of women in STEM, encouragement by family, which doesn't always happen, and encouragement of teachers early on. So I have another poll. We've designed this to be interactive. So we have another poll for you to see which kinds of experiences you've had in STEM, if you've had any of these factors that help to overcome some of these barriers. So there should be a poll up. And you're also welcome to write into the chat if, you know, what kind of strategies you've used when you've bumped up against these barriers, if you've experienced these, and how have these helped? Have these experiences been helpful, or has the lack of these experiences been something that you need to overcome? So you can also put that in the chat. So it looks like somebody's not seeing the poll. So is everyone who can see the poll weighed in? Okay, so maybe we can share the poll. So it looks like we have some people have had role models, but not everyone, a minority of people. We've a couple of people have had effective mentoring, a lot of early undergraduate experiences with research, a good amount of encouragement by family and schooling, not much feeling a part of the STEM community, an experience of the glass ceiling, a few experiences, half people have experienced a leaky pipeline, and a lot of people know someone who's experienced these, and also pretty low in terms of confidence in ability to achieve our STEM goals. So this is fairly typical given the audience that we have. So back to the screen share. So as we see, the picture isn't all that, when we talk in these frames, right, about glass ceilings and leaky pipelines and walls, it can feel pretty negative, right? And we saw from those results of our own experiences, people have had experiences, maybe we got encouragement, maybe we have some role models, but still very low in terms of feeling like we can achieve our goals, seeing a lot of people in the leaky pipeline. So these kinds of metaphors, when we think about leaky pipelines, right? Like it's pretty disgusting, right? Pipelines carry sewage, they're anaerobic. My feminist science studies colleague, Banu Subramaniam, has written about this. And when we think about overcoming walls and barriers, we think often about militarized boundaries. And even the thought of like shattering the glass ceiling, right? Broken glass, it's very painful and leaves shards of broken glass on the ground for those who follow us. So we really need different kinds of metaphors to think about intersectional STEM equity and gender equity. Things like windows that help us see outside and others see in, and maybe even let the fresh air go back and forth. Bridges that to overcome these kind of big chasms, right? And networks. Up here we have neural networks, right, that help us think about making all different kinds of connections at all different levels that isn't quite so hierarchical and doesn't focus so much on that sort of like linear CV, but focuses on the stories and experiences and interactions behind our passion for STEM and being able to bring in and welcome in a wider range of women into STEM. And research on women's experiences in STEM that's more qualitative in nature tends to bear that out. So this is a study done by Mary Ammon, who's at the University of Central Florida, looking through the glass ceiling. This was a photo voice study where women in STEM, is a leadership development project. Women in STEM were asked to, in the past, we used to like give disposable cameras to people, but now most people have cameras on their phones. So people are asked to bring photographs to illustrate important aspects of their lived experience in STEM. So this allows an emphasis on place and affect, the experience of what it's like to actually live through the STEM experience for women. So women brought in pictures and were asked to explain how that they related to their experience. So when we talk about the glass ceiling, that's a very kind of linear hierarchy, right? That we're supposed to ascend in this sort of line, and at some point we bump up against this invisible and painful glass ceiling, and maybe some of us can break through it, but it's very, very challenging and difficult. But results of this more qualitative study suggest that many of the strategies that women talk about in terms of their experiences in STEM don't necessarily fit in such a linear hierarchy, right? It's not always just a matter of climbing up that ladder in a linear path. And understanding the lived experience of intersectional lived experience of women as they live and engage in STEM can help us move from seeing women as problematic, right, as this problem that has to be solved. We have to get more of them into the pipeline and we have to get more of them to be successful, to looking at how gender is created as structural and intersectional in STEM, so that that gender doesn't come first, but gender is actually, and these gender barriers are actually created by the structures in STEM. I do want to say about this study. It was done at a research institution. Again, it was focused on leadership. It included people who identified as women along the whole spectrum of the career path, students, faculty, administrators, and the racial and ethnic breakdown of the women identified participants mirrored participation in STEM, but we know that that's not equitable in terms of racial and ethnic breakdown of the population. So it was approximately 2/3 white women identified participants, about 22% Asian identified women participants, and much smaller percentages of Black and Latina STEM practitioners, and very, very few Indigenous and Native women. So this is a sort of a capture of the women who are there and who've made it through those barriers. So, can't go back. All right. So some of the more specific findings from this study is that the motivation for many of the women in this study to stay in STEM and to continue their participation despite the challenges is focuses on collaboration, on social impact, and self-development. So these are some of the themes. So that women in STEM are more likely to want to be focused on working towards a common goal, to see the social value and the community impact of their work and their research, and then seeing participation in STEM as a way of self-development, advancing personal skills and potential, which doesn't always line up necessarily with what institutions see as the kinds of career advancement. So again, thinking more about these metaphors about windows and bridges and networks, right? So things, the common good and common goals and social and community impact. And again, we see that these are not always the values that help us get ahead in our careers in STEM, or that we see emphasized as we go through these pathways. The study also identified barriers, and some of those barriers were a lack of authority. So being excluded from important decision-making, not being given authority in the lab. When I was an undergraduate working in my immunology lab at Harvard, people would get out of the elevator and pop their head into my lab room and say, are you Roberta? Because our secretary was named Roberta. And there was a long hallway. The secretary's office was at the front of the lab, but people would always think for some reason that I was there with my pipette in my hand. They would think I was the secretary. So again, lack of authority, not really even being seen as someone who is actually doing science in the lab. I do want to point out that, you know, as a white woman, I was mistaken for the secretary, but there's also experiences, women of color, particularly Black and Latina scientists, women in science, they're not necessarily mistaken for the secretary, they're mistaken for the cleaning staff or the janitor. So again, that's an example of sort of the intersectional impact, but the different ways that this lack of authority can play out for women with different identities and different social positions. Their study also identified a high degree of vigilance for others, having to monitor for interpersonal cues much more carefully. And again, not necessarily feeling part of a community, feeling as an outsider takes up a lot of energy and time that, you know, we could also be spending thinking about solving our scientific problems, devoting to our research. And then, of course, gender stereotypes. I think that goes without saying that we experience a lot of gender stereotyping. And again, that's intersectional stereotyping where race, disability, immigration status, first generation, many of the participants today are first generation. I went to the same community college that my mother went to when I was in high school, so we actually almost overlapped. Not everyone comes from a background where higher education and particularly science and technology are seen as, or understood or experienced as the norm. So this over here. So there's the motivation, and then there are the barriers, and then there's the buffers that help to mediate between the motivation and the goals and the things that keep women in, and then the barriers and the things that kind of push them down or get us discouraged. So some of those buffers are accomplishment, and that is recognition and positive experiences, right? So accomplishment can be not just like what you get on your CV and not just the degrees and the publications, but also that kind of recognition for not only what we've accomplished, but also the important role that women play, working towards common goals and the community impact. That's so often overlooked, but that is really incredibly important. I think we also have to be careful not to only let that fall into stereotypical, right, the mom role in the laboratory or the department. That can be, that's not necessarily the kind of recognition that we need. But having those positive experiences and being recognized for the important roles that we play can serve as a buffer. Social engagement and projects in projecting value and acceptance, right? So that social element is very important, and that can really vary across, we'll have a poll in just a second, but that can really vary across disciplines, across research groups, across locations, different universities, different departments can have different levels of social engagement. And of course, that needs to work properly, because sometimes social engagement, drinks, afternoon, beer hour, right, can also be very excluding if there's social engagement that excludes. But having that kind of positive social engagement and feeling value and acceptance can be a buffer. And then, of course, there's that elusive work-life balance. We'll do the poll if anybody has found that comfortable balance in their personal and work life. I think we all need some tips on that. And again, what we've been living through with COVID has tipped that balance, made that buffer much more hard to grasp. So, but articulating, seeing both on the basis of research, this qualitative research, and being able to name these as important buffers can also sometimes help us seek ways to value these and recognize we need to seek these out. And I think what MeWell is doing with these events, and I know you have various projects and even actual physical places on campus that are important in terms of providing these buffers. So we have another poll. So we can go to poll number 4, and I hope the poll is getting fixed. I'm not really sure how to make sure everybody can see this poll. Is Martine still? Martine is the one that couldn't see it. So has everybody been able to access the poll, that can see the poll? Okay, so collaboration, about half of you. Social impact, self-development gets high ratings. Lack of authority and vigilance, that doesn't seem to be as prominent here. Gender stereotypes, not surprising. A sense of accomplishment and social support and work-life balance. So we have time in the chat if people want to maybe elaborate. We have one more topic that I want to talk about that will tie into some of the comments that we've just been discussing, which is bringing a feminist perspective to STEM practice. This is something that we aren't there yet, but there's actually a good amount of work and attention being given to what does a feminist practice of STEM look like? Like, what would a feminist lab be? So I want to draw your attention towards this publication, this chapter towards feminist labs, Provocations for Collective Knowledge Making by Maya Livio and Laurie Emerson. And they actually have a website, the Feminist Labs Project, which is really important, fascinating resource. So when we look at STEM through a feminist lens, which is something that I get to spend a good amount of my time doing because of my, going the wrong direction here. There we are. Because of my location and my move into women, gender, and sexuality studies, that gives me more time and more space and more institutional legitimacy to focus in on feminist approaches. So in Livio and Emerson's chapter towards feminist labs, some of the themes that they pull out in terms of thinking about the ways we might change science and change STEM as opposed to necessarily changing the people and leaving the structure the same. We talk a lot about access into STEM, like that's the pipeline, like how can we get more women, more underrepresented groups of people to participate in STEM. And the idea of access is much more complex than just getting people to line up and get through the door, right? It's not just about getting students, women and underrepresented students to take the right courses and be successful in them. But there's a lot of complex issues in terms of access, in terms of resources. It was mentioned already, you have to devote so much time to writing grants and generating funding for your projects, right? Access to materials, who has them and where, and what is the production value, right? Our production value, how much are we producing in terms of publications, in terms of, at our university, Ava knows this, bringing in external funding that supports our university, because half of our grant funding that we get goes to support the research office and the overhead of our campus. So access is much more complex. It goes far beyond just getting people to line up and making that line more diverse and getting more women in line. It also needs to attend to who has access to all those resources and who has access to those resources early on. What kind of school, secondary school, do you go to? What kind of experiences, and is that equitable? So urban, low-income schools, particularly in the United States, we have issues, huge disparities in terms of what kinds of experiences students have very early on in their lives with STEM in particular, because it's resource intensive. And that kind of access also can relate to the knowledge and the value systems. If we look back on the history, the long history of contemporary science and where that's rooted in terms of the scientific revolution, and the legacy of colonial histories and the ways in which STEM fields, science and technology, has played a role in settler colonialism, in racism, the long history of racist science. There's more attention to eugenics, but it filters down into all of our theories, and even just what counts as knowledge and what kinds of knowing and epistemologies, that's the term that we use, but what counts as knowledge and what counts as sort of outside of science and STEM. There's a lot of traditional ecological knowledge that doesn't necessarily count as STEM and may even be counter to some of our values in STEM of objectivity and not engaging our full selves. And particularly in terms of relationship to land and place as well. The other issue is labor in research and labs often gets overlooked, the actual material, physical construction and energy of labor in terms of how is that labor equitably distributed in terms of compensation. There are so many individuals who are laboring in STEM that don't ever get recognized, right? And so we see that hierarchies in the lab for undergraduate students, for graduate students around publications, but far deeper than that, we see often in labs, we have like a research technician, and that person in many cases doesn't get to have their name on any publications, even though they're making all of the solutions or doing that work behind the scenes. We have cleaning staff. They're often there at night and not at the times where we are there practicing. So we don't often even see who those people are or know what they look like. But all those people who are cleaning our labs and all of that. So this question of labor and making visible that invisible labor. And of course, that labor is often skewed in terms of gender and race and socioeconomic status, who those people are that are doing that cleaning versus those who are coming in and writing the grants, receiving the grants, being the PI on grants. Feminist STEM practice also calls into question hierarchies and calls us to really attend to those hierarchies. And as people have mentioned, that involves community relations, right? Like how accessible is what we do in the lab to people in the community? How much is that going to impact people's lives who aren't just working in our lab? And if publication, I always say, you know, these research publications, maybe 10 people in the world can really understand or are going to really engage with what I write, right? Like we read a lot of publications, we cite them, but who's really going to be sitting down and going through that, right? And engaging with that very, very small and narrow subset of people. So what is our research doing for the community? How is it guided by what the values and the needs of our communities are? And that extends also to our research subjects, right? Those of you who have any human connection to your work, often, you know, and I worked with cell tissue culture lines in the laboratory, those came directly from research subjects. They, of course, we want to hide people's identities. We don't name the cell line using the full name. They all had initials, but those cell tissue culture lines came from actual patients, actual people. And how does that relate to our mission and values and the people that actually will benefit? There's also issues around physical safety. Of course, lab safety is very important. When I was a graduate student, we had some lab safety issues, and the PI in my lab, my advisor, my doctoral advisor, passed away from cancer. And then 6 weeks later, a postdoc in her lab also passed away from the same kind of cancer. And there were questions about lab safety. And when I questioned that lab safety, the response was, oh, well, yes, maybe you should be more careful because you're going to have children someday. But, you know, it was very much dismissive of taking care of our physical selves. So the need to take care of our physical selves, both in terms of the materials that we work with and those kinds of exposures, but also just in terms of the lifestyle and the pressure on us. And that goes into our emotional well-being, and the affirmation of our emotional well-being is very, very important. And again, during this time of COVID, that both the physical safety and emotional well-being, I think that has really risen to the fore and is causing some questions to be raised, right? But those questions aren't always well received. So finally, an element of feminist STEM practice is really attending to the non-human as well as the human, right, implications of our work, the planetary implications, material care, supply chains, the kinds of plastic that we use in the lab. That's something else that I've been working with one of my former graduate students who's now a postdoctoral researcher is, you know, when we raise our flies, I don't know if this is going to show here, but do we always need to be using, can we reuse some plastics and materials that will take some of that excess plastic out of the supply chain? So there's all kinds of plastics, there's chemicals that we use, just paying attention to the planetary impacts and our non-human participants in our research as well. The fruit flies, and how does do our research subjects that are non-human also, do we value them? So I do have one more poll. I don't know if people want to do another poll or we just want to skip to, see if I can advance to the next slide here. Oh, before we get to the discussion in the poll, I do want to mention Eva Thanheiser is here, who is the PI on this project, but I want to mention a project that we have, we're just beginning at Portland State to gather more data and to try to bring a feminist and critical race approach to some of these questions around diversity in STEM and making STEM more inclusive, not necessarily changing people, but thinking about how we change STEM and the physical experience, the places. So this project is called C Data. It's funded by the National Science Foundation. They like these acronyms. And this is a project for institutional transformation, and this particularly a planning project. So we're looking at how we can plan some really significant interventions on our campus. So to do that, similar to the photo voice approach in the study I referred to earlier, we are going to collect through qualitative interviewing, counter narratives and counter storytelling. This is a methodological approach that has its roots in critical race theory. So when we look at individuals who are marginalized or are underrepresented in STEM and in academic STEM, how can their counter narratives and counter storytelling inform us about things that we don't get to see on the surface? And then we are going to involve our research subjects in a mapping project where we map their experience in places and spaces, their relationships with people, how power flows, and look at policies and processes. So these kind of 5 Ps, we're going to develop a map, not just of their experience within our institution, but for example, places and spaces, home, and look at how, what kind of affect, how people are feeling in these different places and spaces. So how do you feel in your department meeting, right? You're in your lab group, in your classroom, at home, at church, whatever the elements are, and the places and spaces, and who are you relating to in these different spaces and places? So your children, your extended family, your advisor. And how are these policies that we have? We have some equity policies at our institution, but how are they impacting people and how are people feeling? So taking this mapping approach, we're hoping to develop a toolkit that can be applied and used at other institutions as well. And then this will inform our plan for making some changes at our own institution. We're a very interdisciplinary group. Our principal investigator, our lead is Eva Thanheiser, who is here today. And then we have faculty from geography, from world languages, from psychology, and myself from WGSS. And as I mentioned, I remind people I'm also a biologist. So this is a project that we're getting started on here today. So I'll stop the sharing here. We can come back.